as we had heard in interviews time and time again, the woman was in the house. She was seated by the window. I can see her through the screen, and she would occasionally shout something out. So the minute they cuffed him, he wasn't under arrest. They were going to take him back to the squad and ask him questions. She yells out the window, "I don't want him charged. I just wanted him to leave."
Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. On May 8th, the Daily Citizen began a 4-part investigative report on domestic violence in the Springfield area. The data is disturbing. Of the state's 10 largest cities, Springfield has the highest reported rate of domestic violence. There are several possible explanations for this statistic. The high rate could be because we are putting our heads in the sand and ignoring the problem. Or it might be that we have an ingrained culture here that tolerates abuse. Joining me today are veteran reporters Steve Pokin and Jackie Rehwald, who produced this series. It is called Living in Fear. Steve and Jackie, welcome to In Our Town.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks.
Let me throw out this question. Why did the Daily Citizen decide to investigate this matter?
As a reporter, we're required to come up with a major project once a year. That's the expectation from David Steffler. So I pitched this topic. Pitched it because I wanted to do something that I felt resonated with the community. Since I moved here, I've always heard that this was the domestic violence capital of Missouri.
And you moved here from St. Louis, is that right?
St. Charles, near St. Louis.
That area, generally.
I had to pick a project, and this is the one I picked, and I thought it was of relevance to the area.
So how deep a dive did you go into the data?
I think this is the first time we've compiled at the Citizen 2 unique databases. Jackie did most of the work on that.
So what were the databases that you used to produce this series, Jackie?
We looked at CaseNet, which is the online court dockets for the state of Missouri, and we chose to pull all the domestic assault charges that were filed in 2022. And we started on this early January, and both Steve and I went through every charge filed in 2022 and pulled out all the domestic assaults. And we created one really large database. It took us a couple weeks to get all of them. And there were 397 different defendants. And from that, we created a second database that looked at the probable cause statements for those.
So there were roughly 400 cases that you looked at, but the number of reported incidents was even much greater than that, isn't it?
Right.
I was thinking it was around 2,300 that were reported, if memory serves. But even that doesn't represent the extent of how much domestic violence occurs here in the Springfield area. What do experts say on that?
Only about 25% of incidents get reported to police.
Just doing my arithmetic, maybe 10,000 cases
Right.
that occurred, 2,300 of them or so result in a phone call. And then that did, in fact, result to just a little less than 400 cases that ended up in the court system.
Right, and even more are then dropped most oftentimes because the victim doesn't cooperate with the prosecution.
What percent of the time does the victim just decide that it's not a good idea to proceed with it?
Emily Shook, Greene County's lead prosecutor for domestic assault charges, she told us that about 80% of victims at some point change their mind about cooperating with prosecution.
I'm sure there are several reasons, but what are some of the top reasons that a victim would decide to not go forward with the case?
A lot of times they're afraid. The defendant is often an intimate partner or spouse, and they'll threaten suicide. They have children with their abuser, and they know that the courts will probably give them shared custody. The abuser sometimes threatens the children, threatens to take the children. They sometimes threaten their pets. They sometimes abuse their pets. They sometimes kill their pets.
Also, where do you go? One of the
They don't have any option frequently, do they?
the hallmark of domestic violence is power and control. And it can be a slow process where if you're the victim, before you know it, you don't have to work. You know, I'll take care of you. Why do you have to see your friends? I'll manage your checkbook. Let's not go see anybody. Let's not see your parents. So you become more and more isolated and more beholden to the person who's your abuser, without a job, without money. Where do you go? And one of the things that kind of surprises me, even after the most horrible cases, there's still a sentiment of caring and love in many cases, and the shared children that makes it difficult.
My impression is that people who molest children sexually frequently were the victims of molestation when they were children. And I wonder if you have a feel for whether this is, to some extent, just sort of a learned behavior that somebody may have picked up in a dysfunctional family, and now they're repeating it when they're adult. Is there any basis to think that, or do you have a sense for that?
We talked to Brandy Bartell over at the Victim Center about that, and she said there's not really data that supports that they grow up to become abusers, but they are more likely to grow up to become victims. But if you're growing up in a household with it, it becomes normal. It becomes okay.
Let's dream up a hypothetical case. Steve, come up with some case of domestic abuse here in Springfield between a man and a woman. I know that there are 1,000 variations, but what would be something that would be pretty ordinary to have happen? The phone call comes in, and what happens next?
Part of the reporting process is Jackie and I both spent hours with police who responded to domestic violence calls. So I'll tell a story that I witnessed with a police officer.
Okay.
The call comes in, he reads it on his screen in his car. Man was being abusive, he's drunk, he won't leave, there are kids in the house, he does not have a gun, but he went back into the house. So the officer that I was with was very concerned about, he didn't have a gun, but he went back in the house. Why did he go back in the house? So we show up, and there's a man sitting in the driveway by himself drinking beer, and he's got a grill going, and he's got a big log in there. So he's just watching the log burn. And he's got a big backpack. And the long and short of it was the alleged abuser got a little belligerent with police in terms of removing the backpack and listening to commands. And you never want to do that. They don't like to respond solo because it's a very, very dangerous situation. The person who appears to be the victim can suddenly change loyalties. So now instead of fighting one person, you're fighting two people or maybe more. So they cuffed him. And as we had heard in interviews time and time again, the woman was in the house. She was seated by the window. I can see her through the screen. And she would occasionally shout something out. So the minute they cuffed him, he wasn't under arrest. They were going to take him back to the squad and ask him questions. She yells out the window, "I don't want him charged. I just wanted him to leave." And that is one of the major frustrations of police is you don't call the police if you just want somebody to leave. That's not a crime. If you're at a party and somebody is behaving badly, you wish they would leave, don't call the police to ask them to leave.
So the police don't want them to call, is that what you're saying?
They want you to call if you're serious about pressing charges. Once the initiative of removing that person is gone, the victim is thinking, that's all I wanted, So the police came and they got him to go, I'm good.
That was one specific instance, but do you have a sense for, in general, if this is happening, what percent of the time they're going to get repeat calls to the same home?
I think that happens quite a bit. In our PC statements, we've seen references to 16 and 20 times to the same address. But according to Missouri law, if you're called back on a domestic violence call to the same address within 12 hours, you got to arrest somebody. And the person they usually arrest is they call the primary aggressor. So even if both parties are swinging at each other, you sort it out. The officer has a tremendously difficult job to sort it out and arrest the primary aggressor.
What percent of the time is the victim female?
I think in our database, 85% of the defendants were male,
So they would have been the abuser.
and the vast majority of the time they're abusing a female. But it happens the other way as well.
If it's frequently, though, if it's a woman who is the abuser, about half the time she's in a fight with another woman.
We read a PC statement, where a probable cause statement, which is filed by the officer, of a woman who stabbed her significant other in the back with a knife. I think it was like in a grocery store or something, and the officer had said that he checked in the last 2 years they had been to that residence 16 to 20 times.
So is there no alternative for police or the sheriff's office to deal with issues like this when you're getting repeated calls? The victim's unwilling to press charges?
They can sometimes prosecute without the victim's cooperation. I attended a sentencing hearing about a week ago where the victim did not want to cooperate at all with police, but it was her husband. It was a brutal attack, and at some point she was naked, and he had also sprayed her with water, and it was a snowy night, and she walked naked with just a towel to the police department. So she was on video, and she came into the police department, and the first thing the officer asked was, "What happened to your forehead?" Because her forehead was bleeding. He had headbutted her. And those first few statements out of her mouth were allowed as evidence, as excited utterances.
So they have to have something pretty visual and extraordinary to be able to make a case.
Yeah, and in that case, there were obvious injuries, which there aren't always bruises. So they had photographs of her injuries. They had her initial statements to police.
A lot of people that don't go to the courthouse probably don't know what a suspended imposition of sentence is. But for our listeners, it basically means there's nothing on your record until you're sentenced. And pretty common in these situations, as well in other criminal affairs, to basically tell the defendant, look, we're going to put you on 6 months probation, and you've got to do this, get counseling and that sort of thing, and not have a repeat event. And if you keep your nose clean for whatever the date is, 6 months or a year, then there won't be any record of what's happened. That's a pretty common outcome for those cases that actually do go to a plea, isn't it?
It took me a while to get this straight in my head, but there are two different things. One is a suspended execution of sentence, and that's primarily what we saw, where the judge will say, you're going to jail for 2 years, but I'm going to give you an SES. You're on probation, and if you complete your probation, as you never go to jail, but it's on your record. That was what we saw time and time again. What you're talking is suspended imposition of sentence,
Right.
which is what defendants would prefer, is the same process, but after probation, it is not on your record.
Thank you. I didn't realize there was a difference there. Does that seem to make any difference in whether somebody ends up being a repeat offender?
Well, we certainly have seen many instances where people are repeat offenders, people violate orders of protection. The prosecutors try to get that conviction on the record because some of the charges legally are described as they are an enhanced if you're a repeat offender. So the SES, you still have that. For instance, if there's a misdemeanor charge that specifically states in law, on your third conviction, it's a higher penalty. They try to get that conviction.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon Kay, and I'm the visual journalist at the Springfield Daily Citizen. I started out working overnights at KTTS. I did do my internship at KSMU. After that, I traveled on down to Branson. I very quickly became the news director down there. Afterward, I started working for Carbon Trace Productions, and there I was the executive director. I really see being a journalist in general as being a public service. My days, they are both regimented and not at all. Doing like my day-to-day task, which includes like the calendar and the obits, from touring along with one of the reporters to working on a Photoshop project so that way we can really make our product here at Springfield Daily Citizen shine. One of my favorite things about living in Springfield is that you never know who you are going to meet. We are one of those big, small towns, and so you can meet these people that are internationally famous and you find out that they live in Springfield.
What would a typical judge's order be for somebody that gets a suspended imposition or suspended execution? What's the judge going to tell him he has to do to stay out of jail?
Typically, it's you're placed on probation, and you go to. A lot of times, don't drink. A lot of times, don't have possession of firearm. A lot with domestic violence. A lot of times, they're ordered to go to a batterer's class. Most of them are for men. There are some for women, where you talk about the dynamics of domestic violence, and we're looking at that in part 3 of the series. And what we have found is that the programs are credentialed by the Department of Corrections, but no one is actually tracking how successful they are.
You know, I was talking to somebody who is familiar with this problem in another state, and in that state, they had a rule that if you got a call, somebody was going to get arrested and get carted off, thinking that that would result in a decreased incidence of violence, but the data indicated that it didn't make much difference. I think we're still searching for a solution to this sort of thing. What's a typical age of an abuser? What's his profile?
Our database of 150 was 35, and it ranged from 18 to 72.
But the bulge in the snake, so to speak, was around 35.
Yes.
What percent of the time, more or less than half, let's say?
What we do have a percentage of is, was it a third of the cases involve strangulation or choking? Jackie has experience in reporting this. I was surprised to learn that that is a big part of domestic violence, is choking the victim, because power and control, like within 7 seconds you can't talk, within a minute you could be dead.
Most of what we've been talking about so far is basically domestic violence between a man and a woman. Is a big part of the reporting involve children too?
We didn't go into child abuse, but in terms of part 2, we look at the issue of, you asked earlier, what prevents sometimes women from leaving. It's victims who have children who don't want to leave because they don't ever want to share custody. They don't want to have the children with what they see as the abuser alone. So they stay in those situations, and the story that's running looks at the problems that many victims face when they have children. They would like to get, when they file a protection order, they also would like to get a protection order for the child who's witnessed all this. But it's very difficult to do that because we talked to 2 judges, criminal judges, and 2 family court commissioners. And in order to get an order of protection for a child, there has to be, the actions have to be directed at the child, not the mother of the child.
At the top of this program, we talked about the fact that according to reported cases, Springfield has the highest incidence of domestic violence on a per capita basis. You guys have studied this quite a bit. Do you think it's really worse here than anywhere else, or we're just doing a better job of reporting it?
I think we do a good job of reporting it. We have the only family justice center in the state. We've been with police officers, and we know that they give out the information. I think it's worse here. And now the million-dollar question is why. That's a little more difficult to say.
I was a reporter at a weekly newspaper outside Springfield. Every Monday, I would go to the sheriff's office and see who got arrested during the past week and that kind of thing. But I'd heard the story about this guy who beat up his wife, and there wasn't anything, nothing had occurred about it. And it was a lot of talk about town. And I asked the sheriff, well, why didn't that guy get arrested? And he said, we don't think we should be interfering in family affairs. Do you think we have that kind of culture here?
Yeah, I think we do. I don't think necessarily with our police or our law enforcement here, but I think there is very much that culture.
What about the policemen and sheriff's deputies you talk to? They see this firsthand. They're on their boots on the ground. Is there any sort of consensus about what they would like to see done?
Repeatedly, we heard from sources who basically said more education. Part of that education is a lot of victims end up blaming themselves, like they're doing something wrong. I didn't do this or I didn't do that. And the education part, the idea is to open their eyes to everything that's happened to you as a form of power and control. I think one of the more significant things to me is, Jackie, if you help me remember exactly what Emily Shook said, and she's the prosecutor, and she was talking to a victim who said, well, this is like the only time he's ever hit me. Emily asked her, well, did you have that information when you went to the Family Justice Center? She said, no, my boyfriend or husband threw it out. Another question was, well, if you mentioned medication, are you still getting your medication? No, he doesn't want me taking my medication. Did you get this in the mail? Yeah, I think I got it in the mail, but he threw it out. Do you have money for this? No, I don't work anymore. It's eye-opening to see the pattern that can lead to the physical violence.
Yeah, after she asked all those questions, she follows it up with, that's abuse. You're being abused.
She just didn't recognize it as abuse. I see. So you mentioned the Family Justice Center a couple times. What happens there?
The Family Justice Center was created, I believe, in 2018, and it is sort of a one-stop shop for victims of any kind of abuse. You walk in and you're paired with an advocate who is either an employee of the Harmony House or the Victim Center, and that advocate will explain to you all the different agencies that are in that one building. You've got law enforcement, prosecutors, legal services, counselors, all these different services that are available, and the victim can pick and choose who they want to talk to. They don't have to talk to law enforcement. They don't have to talk to Children's Division, but maybe they want legal services, and the advocate will bring in somebody from legal services.
My impression is we're the only city in the state that has that.
We are.
And how did that occur?
A few years ago, Greene County Prosecutor Dan Patterson really led the charge to look at this issue and bring a Family Justice Center here to Greene County.
Do you think it's helped?
I think, yes, it has helped, and pretty much everyone we spoke to has said it's a huge help. It's a great resource. The police officer that I rode along with, because he was giving out information about the Greene County Family Justice Center, and he said it's just been an incredible resource to be able to explain what it is, give the phone number and address to victims.
We also have, I know, Harmony House, and I think there's one or two other organizations like that that are able to provide shelter to a mom and their kids, and that's something that a lot of communities don't have too.
They also take men now.
It's the largest domestic violence shelter in the state of Missouri.
Is the demography skewed at all towards any ethnic groups or poverty or racial, anything like that?
We've talked about this, and we've asked that question. To the best of our knowledge in reporting this, it is across the board, but income plays a role in terms of seeking services and going to police. First of all, one of the more basic things is if you're in a lower income, you probably have neighbors across the wall in an apartment, and a lot of times the call comes in from a neighbor. If you're upper income, you're off on 5 acres, and also in those cases, the abused person might have more wherewithal to simply go out and hire an attorney, or more wherewithal to go live with family. So the incidents, we believe, across the board, but the people who wind up in the criminal justice system are more likely to be of a lesser income.
Well, it's a big problem, and at least we're acknowledging it here in our community. You're not going to solve a problem unless you recognize it. This Living in Fear, your first series, of course, was about it being a black eye for Greene County. You've got 3 more parts that'll be coming out over the next several weeks. So what are they?
Part 3 is how systems have failed, and we will be looking at the fact that prosecutors or judges don't have any real numbers on the recidivism rate for anybody who goes to a batterer's class. And we went to a batterer's class. The men talked to us. The men agreed to be photographed, so we heard their stories. And the guy who sponsors it has been doing this for several years, and he said, well, here's the numbers for the last 10 years. Maybe 55% got a certificate. And I said, okay, now who gets these numbers? Who do you give this to? He said, nobody. I got them for you. Probation and parole will probably know individuals. They'll be informed if a guy doesn't go to batterer's class. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the bigger picture of actually what does it work, we don't know. And the other system, we're going to look at is the prevalence of lack of jail time, convictions for domestic assault in the 4th degree.
Are you going to be talking about obstacles to leaving?
Yes, and that's in part 2.
Part 2 focuses on obstacles to leaving, the dynamics of domestic violence and power and control. There's a story about the impact on children in the home.
We were surprised to learn, or at least I was, that I knew that the abused person is probably more likely to be killed when they try to leave. What I didn't know is number 2 on that list is when they are pregnant.
Really?
They're more likely to be physically harmed.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's frankly a depressing subject, but I think it's very important to be focusing on it. But I'm very glad that you guys are writing a part 4, which is searching for solutions, rather than just being the little red hen saying the sky's falling. You're trying to come up with some solutions the community can consider. And I want to thank both of you for your work on this subject and look forward to learning more about it in the upcoming articles. So thank you both for being today's guests in our town.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Tim.
That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/innertown or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.